My first husband, I found out a year into our marriage he was having a homosexual affair. And by the time we separated, we'd been married 14 years, and he told me he'd had about 26 affairs. And then subsequently, it wasn't until after I remarried, I found out that he'd sexually abused my children, our children.
Welcome back to Relevant Christianity. I'm Wayne Blakely. I am grateful that you have tuned in with us today. I have a special guest as normal. I think they're all special, but the guest I have today is Dr. Ann Gillies, and she is a licensed professional counselor, and she has done counseling, but in recent years, she has gone more down the line of the political compromise that is in place and trying to dissect that and help people who are running up against compromise in government as it relates to some of the beliefs that we have as Christians. And that's a real chore because there's so much activism today. I met Dr. Gillies in Poland at a conference there. A couple of times we have seen and had conversations with each other. And so I was grateful that she would be able to join us today. So thank you, Anne, for coming on Relevant Christianity.
It's a pleasure to be here, Wayne.
You have a fairly large family, and I'm wondering how you managed to raise a family and to get involved in a career of, especially a counseling career.
Well, my trajectory isn't the normal one for most families, for most women who go into such a career. I didn't actually. I did work during the time my first and second children after they were born, and then I quit work and stayed home with children, and that was lovely. I loved it, and I was just a secretary, whatever, but I didn't go back to school until my after my last child was born, and
Hmm.
after I would say a devastating loss when my ex-husband at that time, because I'm in a blended family, my ex-husband actually was not convicted of sexual abuse of our children.
Okay.
And that was a huge loss in the sense that for my son, who had spent 3 days testifying, it was just, he was only 13 when that verdict came. My ex was acquitted. So that's a little bit of background. I won't go into any more of that. But then there was all kinds of, I would say, backlash from that because there was already all kinds of emotional stuff and trauma going on for my children. And I remarried, and that's been wonderful because Bob has been a wonderful dad to all of the children. So we have six together, one of our own actually too. And then I went back to school because my pastor thought it would be a good idea. And I'm like, really? Okay. And so I loved school. I took one course because I hadn't graduated high school, actually, circumstances. And so one course led to a PhD. So who would have
Wow.
thought that?
So I
And I
was
started.
wondering if it was through your personal experiences in trauma that drew you into the field of counseling. I'm guessing that the pastor probably saw that you would be a good fit for that.
Yeah, he was a wonderful mentor, and right all the way through. And I had another mentor, an educator. He was a former principal, and he was a wonderful, wonderful man who edited all my stuff, which needed a lot of editing. But yeah,
So
that was kind of how I got going.
you did a number of years of counseling, and then you decided to go down a different vein. What drew you into the political side of things?
Well, yeah, so I did 25 years of private practice focusing on trauma. I loved working with my clients. And
Mhm.
then about 2015, I really felt I needed to start to write. I feel like God really put that on my heart to write books, and I'm like, oh, okay, well, Lord, I like writing, but had never done such a thing. So I published my first book on trauma in 2016. And then in 2017, because it wasn't the book I wanted to write, I wanted to write on same-sex attraction. And because all through my education, I had, as much as I didn't want to research on that, that's where I always ended up. And so then I wrote Closing the Floodgates, Setting the Record Straight on Gender and Sexuality. And that opened a whole other venue for me that I wasn't expecting. I connected with some wonderful people from the Reformed tradition in Canada who advocate and they provide insight to politicians at Parliament and Capitol Hill, and they're a great group. And that kind of pushed me into more of a political vein. So,
Mhm.
and then I met a lot of people. I handed out a lot of copies of Closing the Floodgates to our counselors and to our federal politicians. And although I didn't get a lot of response back, I did get some, and it was very good. So that was good. And yeah, I could go on and on because it turned from advocating into activism, which I never thought I
Yeah.
would ever be involved in.
It's interesting that you said that your first book you wrote wasn't a book that you really wanted to write. Well, I've only written one book and it was a book I really didn't want to write. It was an analysis of another book, but it was much needed. It just wasn't what was on my mind at the time. So I can certainly relate to that. You've written a number of books. Just how many books have you written
I've written six now. I have more that are in here.
in your head?
Um,
Yeah.
I have a children's book that I really liked writing, had a great time writing it. I mean, I just wrote it in 2 or 3 nights. It was so much fun writing, but it's for the culture and tracking a young girl and her friend and the young girl begins to socially transition, and it goes through the process of what happens to the child. Anyways, so I'd like to do a sequel on that. So I have, yeah, 6 books, five five of them actually touching on the whole issue of sexuality, transgender, the
Mhm.
culture. One is called Implosion, when the pendulum swings too far, what's happening in the culture and what we're going to see. Yeah, and I have another one that I want to write called The Great Awakening. And I think this is where well, it's already started, really. I had hoped to write this book last year and it just didn't happen. So,
I
anyways,
can tell
we'll
that
see.
it's much needed. I know a little bit about what you're going to talk about as it relates to that. What drew you into the LGBT topic?
Well, my first husband, I found out a year into our marriage, he was having a homosexual affair. And by the time we separated, we'd been married 14 years, and he told me he'd had about 26 affairs. And then subsequently, it wasn't until after I remarried, I found out that he'd sexually abused our children. And
So
that was, yeah.
the atrocity itself on your within yourself is a very traumatic experience to discover, and then I'm guessing that when you found out that it had to do with your children as well, that just had to be really devastating.
Yes. I mean, I loved my first husband. I mean, I did. I was very young when I married, naive and very gullible as well. Looking back, I think there was a bit of targeting in that, but I can't really know his mind because I can't speak it. But the reality is that what his sin against me is one thing, and I didn't find that it hurt to the core, but it wasn't nearly at the level of what he did to our children. There's no
Mhm,
comparison.
mhm,
There's
mhm.
just Yeah, there's no comparison in the heartbreak and the grief. And so that's been a long journey, and it's still a journey for my
Yeah.
children. Like they still have
Yeah, they carry scars, I'm
they
sure.
carry the scars and they have wounds that are still open and seeping too.
Let's dive a little bit into the normalization of the whole LGBT issue. Really, as we look historically and go back, and it's only been in recent years that people have been willing to, or maybe discovered that this played such a large component, but it really had to do with Alfred Kinsey and his associates, excuse me, as it relates to sexuality and education. And he did some very bizarre things, even in experimentation, by being a self-proclaimed sex researcher. How he got the public school system to adopt his ideas and then bring it into sexual education is phenomenal to me. But even more so, that it would be adopted and brought into Christian schools in the education there as well. What can you tell me about your experience with this?
Well, what I would say is number one is the Kinsey Institute is probably the leading university in teaching sex and sexuality for sex therapists. And so when you and most social workers, probably the huge percentage, psychologists, psychiatrists that delve into the area of sexuality, and also social workers actually, read about Kinsey, hear about Kinsey. Kinsey's promoted in the universities, all with glowing terms, and as though
Yeah. Yeah. It's fascinating.
as though he actually accomplished something, which is incredulous because he totally tried to destroy anything, any right thinking about sexuality, and tried to normalize all kinds of deviant sexuality. I mean, his basic theory was that we are all born bisexual.
Hmm.
That was his theory, based on nothing. It was out of
And they
thin
still
air.
use the Kinsey scale today.
Oh, the Kinsey scale is absolutely, and it's taught in elementary school in grade one, two, so you're born bisexual and you will deviate or you will, you know, um, kind of gravitate to one side or the other, either fully homosexual or fully heterosexual. Now, it's interesting with this scale because it doesn't touch the transgender or gender
Uh-huh.
dysphoria or
Yeah.
anything like that, which kind of is interesting because then you have the gender unicorn that tries to deal with that. There's so many discrepancies, and if people would just take the time and think critically about this, they'd shake their heads and say, this doesn't make sense.
Yeah. Um, can you explain to me what a gay manifesto is?
Well, the Gay Manifesto was written by Marshall Kirk, and it was like Kinsey's work. It was readily adopted politically. In government realms, it's very interesting. So in the universities and in political spheres, and so the Gay Manifesto basically is, and I talk about this. I actually detail all of the items in it, but it's trying to tear apart normative heterosexuality. And one of the things that they really push is the intimidation, marginalization, and the vilification of the Christian church to make the church look inadequate, like we're archaic, all of
Yeah.
those things because the church itself had a moral stance on homosexuality and all kinds of deviant sexual practices. Of course, that has over the last 60 years, the manifesto has many, many elements. Like one of the things that they say, I'm just trying to pick this out of the top of my head, is that we will sodomize your sons. And
Right.
there's so it's actually very disturbing when you read this work, and it's in a book also largely called the work itself is talked about in After the Ball. You're probably familiar with that
Mhm.
word, that book, large book, which really is just trying to tear apart any kind
Yeah.
of moral stance. And the church, unfortunately, because they worked in the media and with all kinds of different platforms to vilify the church after time got tired. Like I believe we fought initially trying to stand up but we were accused of all kinds of insidious
Yes.
things, and that wasn't all necessarily
False.
without some
Right.
validity, right?
Yes.
We
And
know
even
that,
today, still, it's really hard for the church to get their heads wrapped around a redemptive approach to this. It's like they're either all in or they're all out. We can't seem to find the happy medium of I tell people it's difficult for the church to understand how to present both love and truth. They buy into the new definition of love, which is you can do whatever you want to do, and or they reside in the truth only, where they clobber people over the head with the Bible. And what God is calling us to do is to represent His love, but at the same time guide people to His truth, because He is the author of love itself. It's but to watch the indoctrination, which has been huge, has
yes.
been really difficult.
Well, to watch it over the decades and how it's played out, and every single item in the manifesto has come to fruition.
Yeah.
Everything they declared would happen, that they would take over television and media, they would take over the church. And so all of those things have happened, and we've seen the church capitulate. And
Yes.
I think because they didn't have it right, I mean, in many ways. But I think when you look at truth and love, that has been an age-old conundrum, right?
Yeah.
I
Yeah. Yeah.
struggle
On
with
many
that.
issues.
Yeah, on all kinds of issues. I mean, my children would say when they were growing up, "Yeah, Mom, you were all about truth. Where's the love?" And I'm like, well, just do what I'm asking you to do. Kind of silly, but the reality is, there is truth, and we need to really be able to speak the truth with love and kindness. And what I tell people now, and honestly, I when I speak, I just say it's loving and kind to tell the truth, because what
Mhm.
we're finding, and you will notice this, is that we have a generation of the most confused and mentally ill young people.
Yeah.
And excuse me, I think I'm going to sneeze, Wayne. Goodness, I hope
That's
not.
right.
You know
Well,
how
I
that feels.
find that because there was such a focus, I came out in during the sexual revolution of the early 70s. And even at that time, if it wasn't sexualized, what actually really was happening was that our at least the US, and I think in many places around the world, were becoming more fascinated with pleasure, with appetite, with no restriction, no discipline, doing what you felt like doing, and your
Yes.
feelings became your truth, so that the Bible became some kind of antiquated piece of literature that was just far too restricting.
It was irrelevant, right?
Yes.
Because it reduced pleasure. Your personal pleasure wasn't as important as your commitment and
And your
compassion.
destiny.
Yeah, and your destiny. And when you talk about that in the 70s, that's when I married my first husband. And I mean, the pleasure principle and the whole sexual revolution of from the 60s and onward, and now particularly as it's transpired, we have had decades of focusing on personal pleasure. And
Yeah.
look where it's
Yeah.
got us. And I'm not just saying the LGBT, it
Right.
is heterosexual. I mean, Woodstock in Canada was a great success.
Yeah.
What a success of deviancy. I mean, it's just like there's no freedom. And, along with that came the pill. You see,
Yeah.
so in
Right.
all of those things, we have no personal responsibility now. I can just go on the pill and I don't have to worry. I can have as much or sex with as many people as I want and however I want, and there are no consequences. You remove consequences from the behavior, and you're already looking at some problems.
So let's go back to childhood a little bit, and um, as it relates to the current world and the effects of what this sexual revolution has done. What happens to the early sexualization of children and the psychological impact and development even that it affects of a young child?
Well, and this goes for any kind of sexual behavior, right? Introducing young children, and I would say what we're doing in our education system now, we are introducing very young children in Canada, even in kindergarten, to sexual ideologies, to all kinds of, as they go through elementary school, that all kinds of sexual deviance, I would call it.
Sure.
And um, I have some books that I hated to buy because I didn't want to support the authors because they're
You're right.
just terrible. But children's
Sometimes
books,
you have to
and
for a purpose of research. Yeah.
that's right, and children's books. And that I said to my youngest son when one arrived, I said, "Take a look at this. What do you think?" And he just opened it, just opened the into the center and he looked and he said, "Mom, this is porn." I said, "This is
Mm.
for 10-year-olds and it'll be in the hands of younger children, of course." And it is. It's graphic. It's not photos, but it's teaching children
Yeah.
sexual
Mhm.
positions with different, both men to men, women to women, and, heterosexual as well. All kinds of, it just way beyond their years. And so you have young children whose brains are very malleable, and the the brain is very flexible. So what you put into the brain, and we've known
Mhm.
this for years, that the brain can be molded. And so we are molding young generations of children to actually think sexually about every single
Right.
thing all the time.
And I can tell you from someone who lived for 40 years in the LGBTQ culture, when you leave that culture for Christ, people don't realize the damage that has been done. Now some of that sexualization didn't come until I was in my late teens, but certain suggestive things happened earlier in life. And
Yes.
so I can only imagine what it's like for kids that are 5 and 6 and 7, and it gets an imprint upon their mind. And those things don't just disappear when you give your life over to Christ. They're scars that are on your life. They're wounds that have afflicted your soul. And so, we are certainly at a crux now of what we read about in the Bible as to what end times would look like. And, we're returning to the days of what Sodom and Gomorrah appeared to be and are written about, in God's word.
Yes. Yeah, and I mean, you're right. Now, saying this, the brain is flexible. So what you focus on, right? Um, if That's why I've been saying for many years now for parents to get their children out of public education. And, previously, okay, just monitor what's happening, but, in the last many years, it's not about monitoring. They're being fed this ideology 6 hours a day. Not every
Yeah.
single teacher is on board, but more and more they're so pressured to be on
Mhm.
board. And so what you're molding your child to hear, they're hearing things that are actually molding their brain in a sexualized manner. So knowing that the brain is flexible is a good thing because once you get them out of that environment, and we've seen that with gender dysphoric children who are all of a sudden deciding that they are born in the wrong body. If the parent, because there's no help in the schools with that except to affirm this delusion. So if the parent can remove that child from the school system and within 2 or 3 months, as a rule, that child has left that ideology and come back to normalcy. If the parents are actually, promoting a heterosexual type, like male and female binary idea of male and female.
So you
So
can homeschool in Canada.
we can homeschool, thank God, so far. So far
Yes.
we
Yeah.
can, which is
Yeah.
good.
In the
Actually,
US too. Some
yeah, we've
places I
seen a huge
know you
flux.
can't, like in Germany. Yeah.
Sad. It's terrible, isn't it? Because then
Y-
it's all controlled.
Yeah, so the political agenda and influence is huge on the public school system, even seeping over, I think, even into some of the Christian schools as well.
We have Christian schools in Canada that have totally abdicated their responsibility to teach moral truths and biblical truths. The male and female, God created male and female. Yeah, we have that happening, but there are many that are standing firm. So, I mean, there's a benefit financially, right? Any Christian schools that take any funding from the government at all
Yeah,
are
you're at
definitely,
danger. Yeah.
yeah, yeah, so we need to totally pull away from all those government handouts. We need to think more deeply about those kind of things.
Can you talk to me about the dangers of affirmation only and why confirming a biological truth to a child is becoming difficult, like suggesting that gender is different from the biological sex?
Right. Well, yes, and that's actually what's promoted. Actually, biological sex used to be a given. Like that's,
Yeah,
that was
nobody
what
questioned
it
that.
was. Even for the LGBT
Yeah,
uh,
yeah, yeah, yeah. Wasn't until
community.
what, the last 10 years?
Yeah. Yeah. So now we have this idea that binary sex is a social
Forbidden.
construct.
Yeah.
It's now a social construct,
Yeah.
and gender is the carved in stone. This
Yeah.
is
Yeah.
how you are born, which is such a dichotomy because what happens, gender is fluid according to the researchers. So how is it fluid and
When
stable
it
at the
only
same
goes the
time?
direction the LGBT narrative tells you.
Yeah.
Yeah,
Well,
that's confusing to me because if it was really fluid, then you should allow a person to make that choice. You know, this is
yes.
where the whole conversation comes about as it relates to conversion therapy. Is like any therapy that would suggest that you can live differently than how you feel is like outlawed. But why do you care? Why should somebody else care if I want to leave the LGBT world and live according to what my Bible tells me, or even if it didn't, excuse me, have to do with the Bible? But I mean, because there are Muslims and Buddhists and
Yep.
others who decide they don't want to live an LGBT life anymore either. And now it's becoming increasingly difficult to make those choices without repercussions.
Well, in Canada, you face therapists, pastors, and even parents can face $5,000 fine and 10 years in jail
Yes.
if they try to dissuade a child or even an adult. It's,
Yes.
from seeking therapy that would help them,
Yeah.
you know, kind of consolidate their thoughts and feelings and help them explore their sexuality if they want to explore toward heterosexuality. Only the only exploration can be toward LGBT and particularly T, which is it's ludicrous, but those are the laws in Canada, and
Yeah.
Bill C-4 in Canada has
Yes.
led to such a horrendous, I would say, complication of life and the fact that, like you said, it's so discriminatory that, say a lesbian wanted to minimize her pornography viewing. She just wanted to not be looking at so much LGBT porn. You could not counsel her to reduce that in Canada.
Mhm.
If it's a heterosexual, you can counsel against, to help them reduce the addiction to porn, right? Because it's an addictive uh, behavior. So it's an incredibly
But they don't have any problem
discriminatory
with you
view.
introducing it to them.
I'm sorry?
They don't have any problem with you introducing it to
Oh
them.
no. 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 Yeah, it's a very I I mean I see some hope. Um and I'm involved in some different groups, and mostly all of them in the US, actually, because in Canada, people are terrified, and
Yeah.
psychologists and counselors will not speak up about this. The only one is Jordan Peterson, Dr.
Yes.
Peterson, who really kind of exploded on the scene when he called it the pronoun bill in Parliament. And yeah, so he exploded on the scene with that, right? The same month that I was releasing the closing the floodgates. So very interesting kind of together. But, other than him, there's the counselors and psychologists have been silent. Not that they
Yes.
all agree, but they are intimidated into silence. It's very fearful.
So given that, what would you say about the long-term effects then that are going untreated?
Wow. Well, there's so many. There's physical effects because you're going to see a rise in all kinds of sexual diseases.
Right, you have the hormone replacement therapy, you
Oh,
have all
yes.
these things happening that, and if you can't counsel somebody about, living according to their biological sex, then you end up with all these misfits essentially who have been chemically damaged by physicians.
Well, yes. When you start pumping a child full of puberty blockers, which they were not meant to help children transition. Puberty blockers were released medically for precocious puberty for young, very young
Hmm.
children, 8, 9-year-old children who all of a sudden matured too quickly. And there was a limited time they were on, very limited, just to stop the maturation process for a little time. But
So I
now,
wasn't aware that they had been around. So how long have they been around?
oh gosh, it's been a long time. I can't give you an exact, but
So the
decades.
therapeutic use was really for a justified purpose at one point in
Absolutely.
time.
It's never been certified to treat children who have
Changed genders, right?
not what it was for. And then once you have a child who stays on puberty blockers until puberty would have been completed, um, then goes on hormone therapy usually. But even if they quit, if they're on puberty blockers for 4 years, it is very likely that they will be infertile because, they never go through puberty.
Yes,
So
yeah.
all of the things, there's the whole issue with bone density. A young child, between the ages of 10 and 15, that's when so many things happen in the body, in the mind,
Absolutely.
the brain
Yeah.
matures. And you're not getting any of that. So you have smaller physical features. The bones are, not developing the way they should. And also, there's not too many studies that I've come across talking about the effects neurologically, but we know that, when a child goes through puberty, and anyone that's had teenagers knows that it feels like they've lost their mind because because they're 1 minute one way and 1 minute another way, but they
Right.
they can
Yeah.
they can become very childlike again. You know how it is with teens, and they don't get the opportunity to actually mature their thoughts and come into abstract thinking in the
So,
same way.
given the laws the way they are in Canada and in many other places around the world, where it feels like parents don't have any recourse, and what do they do? That kind of brings me into the awakening component that you were mentioning earlier, the spiritual awakening. And are there avenues of which parents can pursue? Are there things that can be done that will help us bring us back into a normal way of living?
Well, the first thing would, to me, especially for speaking to Christian community, is to go back to the Word of God and to really and help. First of all, the parents have to settle, I think, on what they
Mhm.
believe to be true. Because if the parents don't know, if the parents are all over the place, then the child doesn't have that kind of solid foundation to build their life on. And that's for any child, right? So you have those kind of things happening. I think when you talk about where parents go in Canada, it's really, really tough because they can't go to a counselor or social worker or anyone that's going to advise them to reaffirm the child into the biological
Because they
identity.
risk losing their license. Yeah.
They do. They do. That doesn't mean that every single therapist is going to push a gender ideology. There's a few out there, certainly in the US, there's a lot, but in Canada, there are a few that aren't pushing it and really want to help the child, explore a whole lot more, like what makes you think that you're born in the wrong body, like asking questions like that. And the parent actually can do that too. When a 7-year-old comes home and says to the parent, I'm a boy. They're really a girl, but I'm a boy, and I want you to help me to become a boy because they don't understand that they can't be. They know there's a progression because they
Yeah.
really are a boy. Anyways, the parent at that moment has an opportunity to sit down with the child and say, you know, that's a really interesting concept. Like, where did that thought come from? And begin to pull it apart a little bit. Like, ask some questions so the child can answer. I think that that's really where it has to start. If the parent just caves to the child's delusion, which we have this whole aspect of gentle parenting and over the last, I don't know, 20
Yes.
years, and that's created a huge problem because we don't challenge children on their thoughts.
Yeah,
And
that's a whole topic in and of itself that is worthy of a podcast. A lot of my viewers may not have heard of this gentle parenting, but really it is kind of along the lines of the child rules the home. I mean, you just, go along with whatever it's almost, they might as well raise themselves. But
it's very sad actually because a child needs structure, needs
yeah,
repetition, needs boundaries. Like when you're talking about children raising themselves, we see that happening in a generation. The parent goes to the child for advice.
yeah,
What do you think?
yeah,
What color should I paint this room? That's a little silly,
yeah,
but if
but I
it's
get
a
what you mean.
child's
Yeah.
room, I guess, that's fine. But we're asking, and that children aren't able, like they're not prepared for that kind of stuff. They want to be kids and they need to be kids and they need parents to have some structure. And I mean that people will say, oh, well, that's ridiculous. Of course you can ask the child,
Yeah.
but parents ask the children, which house should we buy? Is the child paying for this house? Like,
Right.
you want to act in the best interest of the child. That doesn't mean you want the child to be the one giving all the direction.
And the social accommodation and the social media plays largely into the power of suggestion today. And now it's not just the power of suggestion, but now they begin to legalize concepts that you couldn't dream of. The protectiveness of a child that is dressing and behaving correctly at home, but goes to school and is encouraged even by the teacher to live out a whole different gender there,
That's
including how
right.
they dress. Yeah.
That's right. And don't tell the parents.
Right. Yeah.
There's,
Yeah.
I
They'll
mean, in
keep the
Canada, they
secret.
don't have to tell the parents. In fact, um, one young girl I interviewed a few years ago, she was 12 and autistic. You see, there's a whole other issue, how children, autistic children are targeted in the what's it called, Gay Straight Alliance groups, and
Yes.
they're targeted. And so bring them in because they have some they're having trouble, socializing with other kids. And, we'll welcome you and we will take care of you. And they're sold a bill of goods, which unfortunately does not pay well. And, this one young girl I interviewed talked about her trajectory and how it had started in grade 8, and she was introduced by her teacher to this group and went through most of the year till June, and then parents never knowing. And then the principal calls the parents one day and said, your child's just been taken to the hospital. She's suicidal." They were devastated. They had no idea what was
Mm.
going on. And when they found out, they were absolutely devastated.
Of
And they
course.
were Mormon
Mhm.
parents. And this young girl, so she had spent, the whole school year deceiving her parents. What happens
Wow.
when you deceive? What happens when you constantly have to lie and cover up? There's this thing, this is psychologically, it's
Yeah, it was major
damaging.
consequences. Yeah.
Absolutely. Anyways, they never sent her back to that school. And the next year, she was completely rejected because she got in touch with, she liked to do more masculine things. She was a tomboy
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
with a disability, you know. And when she found out that girls and women could skateboard and do things, it was like, "Oh, I don't have to be trans to do this?" Well, of course not. And so she gave it all up. And you see, we've lost our generations of tomboys, which I was a terrible tomboy back in the day. But, here we've used all this against children. It's like weaponizing normalcy.
Yeah, it is.
Yeah.
So when we look across the broad spectrum of Christianity today and we see the inclusion, the accommodation, the toleration, and all of these things, how do we get to going back to the core, well, ultimately the respect and honor for God in the way He designed us to be, and the desires that He has for us to live according to His will instead of our own?
Well, back to the core is back to the word, right? But I see a lot of things happening, and I'll speak for Canada. Well, I see a lot of things happening in the US. Let me
It's
start
a
there.
crazy place right now.
It is very crazy, but you have a whole movement, and certainly Charlie Kirk's death, his
Hmm.
assassination,
Yeah.
martyrdom, really blew it up in a sense that what you see is people and college students and young people are thirsty for truth. They are thirsty for something to hold on to. Our children
Yes.
need those foundations. So it's not a time for the church to kind of back up any further. We've backed up too far as it is. It's a
Right.
time to move forward. And again, it's kind and loving to speak the truth. So do it in a way that's loving, but don't back away from truth and don't give in.
Yes.
That's the big thing. And in Canada, that's happening too. I see some things shifting a little, not like in the US, but the backlash is horrendous because
Hmm.
it encompasses more than just this issue of LGBTQ.
Yeah, my fear here is a little bit down the road of a false revival. And, we have to be careful. The Charlie Kirk movement really has helped in directing people to go back into a church environment. But what is the stability of that environment? And it has to be more than a feel-good place. And
Yes.
we do need to embrace the young people and help them realize that God has answers and solutions, but then point to those and educate people back into God's ways that are more disciplinary than the ways of which we've been living over the last, 50 years or so.
Well, I just think of Rosario Butterfield. Um,
Yes. Mhm.
and, practicing lesbian, a university professor,
Yeah.
well-educated, brilliant woman. And she wasn't, she got involved because of someone on her street. And I'm not sure if it was the pastor of the church, but it was a Presbyterian church, a mainline
Yes.
church, but
Uh-huh.
they were very determined to teach the word and encourage.
She
And it
was
was
determined not to acquiesce.
Yeah. And it took her a while. That's okay. People are going to have to figure this out. Young people will have to figure
Yes.
this out. We have to give them time. Remember what we talked about earlier, their minds have embraced a delusion
Yeah.
that,
Yeah.
you know, the father of lies is called that in the Word of God because he's incredibly gifted at lying and convincing. You don't have to have a big lie. You just tell a little one, and then lots of things creep in. So to come back from listening and believing the lies into the truth, wow, that takes some time. It takes a lot of serious
Oh, it'll bring about
conversation.
some division even in the church.
And it takes mentoring. This is
Yeah.
this is a
Yeah.
real issue that young people, and doesn't have to, you don't have to be young. We all need mentoring and discipleship. What does that look like? What does it mean? And so it means a lot of commitment and a lot of, I think this is where home Bible studies and things like that are very important. So people have an opportunity to actually express what they're thinking and a time to search it out in the Word of God.
So, Anne, how in churches where they've adopted drag queen story hour and the whole um, involvement of even ordaining LGBT people as pastors and elders and stuff, how do we respond to that? How do we get back to a a biblical core? I mean, what does if people have acquiesced to that, if they have indoctrinated that into their environment, do you think there's really a turning back point?
There's a couple things going through my mind. First of
Mhm.
all, is this phrase, the abomination of desolation, and I don't know if it really applies to this, but I've always felt that in my heart, when we see the sacrificing on the altar that God calls an abomination of desolation. And I think we have sacrificed on the LGBTQ altar as the church. And
Yeah.
I mean, maybe that's too philosophical, but the other thing about this is churches that have gone that far, and we have some denominations certainly in Canada for sure. In 1988, the United Church of Canada chose to begin ordaining homosexual men and lesbians. And I remember way back then, standing firm and
Mm.
writing letters and those kind of things. But when the church, when the leadership, when the shepherds um, no longer shepherd the sheep, and
Yeah.
Ezekiel 34 talks about this, God is going to remove the shepherds. Either they are going to repent and come into a place of righteousness, or he's going to remove them. And I don't know how or when. Those churches um, have totally capitulated, and they are full of false prophets and full of people that are speaking lies to our young people and deceiving. So I don't know how they can come back unless the shepherds repent. That's it really has to.
Yeah.
And even for other churches who do not invite drag queens in, there is to me the leadership of denominations across the board need to repent of
Yes. Yes.
not standing for truth. And they may not have, embraced all of the dogma out there in the culture. Sometimes they just kind of look the other way. And especially with the trans movement, I've seen that there's been this whole, like, well, these children, we have to affirm them because, they'll kill themselves. They've listened to the rhetoric
Yeah.
and the absolute lies that, and there has to be a repentance across the
Yes.
board.
Yeah, I advise people, remember God is a God of preserving life and certainly not of taking life. And so often the accusation that comes from the LGBT community is that Christians' ways, are such that encourage an LGBT person to commit suicide or that it leads to that. That's actually coming from the enemy that of God, that is against God's ways. And so, God is a God of victory, of healing, and of hope. And if you're a pastor, an elder, a church member, or a parent, we need to invite LGBT people into the church and to walk with them on the journey. Yes, there are some people that, like who smoke and pray, and the next day they no longer have a desire for a cigarette. But there are those that will also be tempted with the desire for a cigarette maybe throughout the entirety of their lives because they have experienced it and they didn't need to. God didn't ask them to do this. It was a choice they made or that I made. And so I, again, as I talked about earlier, you have those scars that you carry with you, but
Yes.
God is a God of healing. He will see you through. He has great desires, great plans for you. He says, I know the plans that I have for you, and it's plans for good, not of evil." And so there is hope. He gave us his word that's great and truthful and hopeful all the way from Genesis to Revelation for all time, which I do believe is rapidly coming to an end as we look at prophecy and see how it's all unfolded. But rather than, giving into the demands, uphold God's ways
Yes.
and walk with the individual through their journey. They may have some hiccups along the way. They may fall. It's like somebody who's been drinking, who got sober. If they fall back, don't kick them to the curb, but encourage them to get back up because God says, "I'm here for you. I haven't given up on you. I will not abandon you." We really do need to bring a level of both love and truth forward to evangelizing to those who have had difficult experiences. A lot that has been brought on by social media. Today, you're even hear about young people. I'm not so sure that some of the adults aren't doing this too, but they're going to AI for counseling,
Mm.
and there's even been suicide as the result of this. And we're living in desperate times, and they call for desperate measures, but
Yes.
God has the answers for all those things. You have your ministry is restoring the mosaic. Tell me a
Yes.
little bit about that.
Well, I decided that I needed to have a website and do some stuff because I was getting involved politically. And so Restoring the Mosaic really was a way for me to, you know, be able to encounter and to advise, I guess, or to dialogue with politicians and community leaders and pastors, and to be able to kind of, to me, restoring the mosaic goes back to our foundation. And I was thinking Canadian mosaic, right? Which is Canada has always had this wonderful and I call it mosaic. I don't like melting pot. They used to call them melting
Mhm.
pot of cultures, right? But to me, it's like a beautiful mosaic. And we need to have that, but underneath that, understand that we're, we still are, I hope, but not quite to the same extent, a Judeo-Christian country. We were recognized for that and our kindness. So that restoring the mosaic is kind of looking at the future to take it into the past. That doesn't make sense. Just a minute.
For the purposes of recovery. Yeah.
It's like, how can we restore what has been lost
Mhm.
that is good and keep this mosaic. It can keep growing because mosaics are amazing, and yet we all blend together well. Whatever even our religious background, Canada's been known as a very tolerant society, a very tolerant country. Well, that's got us into a lot of other issues and a lot of other problems, right? So we'll see where all that goes. But that's what it's about. For me, it's about communicating with those in leadership to have truth on the whole issue of LGBTQ and trauma, particularly because with
Yeah.
most of probably 90% of LGBTQ have a history of trauma in their background. And that's where you get
Mhm.
the suicidal ideation
Right.
from,
Right.
because all of that trauma, and then they're seeking resolution. So, yeah, it's not because they decided that they went for conversion therapy. That's,
Right.
yeah, anyways.
Well, I'm going to put up a link to your website, and I see that people can come in contact with the books that you've written there. And I see that a lot of them are available on Amazon. So,
Yes,
if that poses a problem to somebody who is ordering that's in the US, it might be easier to order off of
yes,
Amazon.
easier.
But I really have enjoyed our conversation, and I am certain that it will be beneficial to many, whether it's a parent or somebody who may be struggling with LGBT ideations, pastors, members. There's so much education that is needed on this topic today because we have really gone to such extremes as it relates to embracing these ideas and maybe not going about what we can do as believers to represent Jesus and help people really recognize the true identity that God has intended for them.
Amen.
Anything that you would like to say in parting?
Well, thank you for doing this interview. I appreciate what you're doing, and I think we need to really look at how does the church respond, but how does the church lead? We've got to get
Yes.
back to leading the culture instead of being wrapped up and joining the culture.
Yeah, exactly. Thank you so much. And if you have enjoyed our conversation, be sure and click on the like button below. And it would be great if you would hit subscribe as well. If you click on the bell, you'll get notified when the new podcasts come out, and they come out every Friday at 3 p.m. Eastern. If you're interested in more about my personal ministry, you can go to knowhislove.org. KNOW, know, like get to know him. Knowhislove.org. Thanks so much for tuning in today, and I will see you again next week.